jubilant Jimmy Hoffa sweeps in as new president of the Teamsters.
Only Jimmy Hoffa can rejoice at his continued good luck. Honest union members and the general public can only regard it as a tragedy.
I stand here today before you as I stood in front of that court and took an oath that I was not then guilty, nor am I guilty now.
You put down 2 or 3 sticks of dynamite, you put 2 sandbags against it, that blows it inward, not outward.
Is that what you're testifying before this committee?
I'm saying that I do not recall.
Although I never gave up hope, and my grateful thanks to President Nixon for making this possible.
We have faith that someone, somehow, somewhere, can help us locate our father.
Murdered, 55-gallon drum, Gateway Transportation, New Jersey.
Are you absolutely certain that no one within 299 had anything to do with that car bombing?
I would bet my life on it.
Most people know very little about Jimmy Hoffa. He was a union leader, he disappeared, and nobody knows what happened to him. But the story is much more complicated than that. Tracking Hoffa's rise to power leads you to the muscle of organized crime. Tracking the Teamsters pension fund that Hoffa founded leads to Las Vegas, which he helped build by funneling millions of dollars to the mob. Tracking Hoffa's downfall takes you through a web of corruption, betrayal, and in the end, murder. This is a story about power. There was nothing Jimmy Hoffa wouldn't do to have it. And when he lost it, nothing he wouldn't do to get it back.
That every strike we have with employers who really want to fight, they revert to hiring hoodlums. And unless we know who our enemy is, unless we're in a position to do something about it, you'll lose your strike.
Jimmy Hoffa grew up a fighter. At an early age, he saw how hard life could be on a working family. He was just 6 years old when his father died, very likely from years working the coal mines in Indiana. Jimmy's mother moved the family to Detroit. At age 14, he dropped out of school and went to work to help support his family. At age 18, he organized his first strike while working for the Kroger Company, unloading produce from refrigerated boxcars for 32 cents an hour.
The work was grimy, it was tough, it didn't pay much, and all of those things caused Hoffa to think, this is no way to make a living.
One sweltering summer day, Jimmy convinced fellow dock workers to stop unloading a shipment of strawberries. The foreman demanded they get back to work, berating and threatening the crew. Young Jimmy stood firm and handed over a list of demands. With fresh fruit spoiling on the loading dock, Jimmy Hoffa won his first negotiation for the group that became known as the Strawberry Boys. His career as a union organizer was launched. American workers needed a leader, and they had found one.
People were in misery, economic misery. You look at it, you had a third of the nation unemployed.
Many of those lucky enough to hold a job were powerless to the crushing weight of big business.
You could be fired for organizing. Companies would hire off-duty policemen. They would use them to bust up picket lines.
In 1937, the threat of workers organizing led to a deadly confrontation on Memorial Day in Chicago. A crowd of protesting workers marched on Republic Steel Mill. A formation of Chicago police opened fire, wounding over 100 workers, killing 10. That same spring in Detroit, a group of UAW members were beaten outside Ford Motor Company's River Rouge complex in a confrontation known as the Battle of the Overpass. They were trying to hand out leaflets calling for better pay. Hoffa was not part of either event, but he watched and learned. It never bothered Jimmy to get bloodied on the front line.
Hoffa believed that business was a rigged system, and he would do whatever it takes to win.
For Jimmy Hoffa, the only rule was to win. Power, the only worthwhile commodity. Violence, the bargaining tool of choice.
He was dealing in an environment, I think, in which people exercised power very physically, very violently at that point in time. It's what you grew up in the 1930s and the labor movement in the 1940s. It was a hard business. You had to be tough to survive. You had to fight.
But to carry that fight, Hoffa needed muscle. and he knew where to get it.
He started interacting with guys like the Maley brothers, Santo Perone, Frankie Three Fingers Coppola. Guys like that were kind of bringing Hoffa into the organized crime mix of Detroit.
With powerful friends behind him, Jimmy Hoffa rose quickly in the Teamsters Union as a recruiter and organizer. In Hoffa, workers saw hope. The mob saw opportunity.
The racketeers saw Hoffa as a rising star, someone that had a lot of savvy, a lot of swagger, someone that was a natural leader and had the ability to do their bidding if they got him into power.
Detroit Local 299 became well known as one of the Teamsters' most violent and fierce locals. There were bombings of businesses, employers Hoffa considered enemies. For that work, he hired a bomb expert, a guy named Joe Franco.
We all carried sandbags in our car because you put down 2 or 3 sticks of dynamite, you put 2 sandbags against it, that blows it inward, not outward.
Franco said that back in the old days, there were 2 kinds of jobs that Hoffa required.
95% of it was in-house, but the bad stuff was about 5% out of the house. And he would hire that. The bad stuff. Bad stuff. What's real bad? We're killing somebody, putting somebody in the hospital. That was in-house. Blowing up a truck. That's not going to hurt nobody. To settle a strike, fighting on the picket lines. That was in-house. That's all in-house. That's all labor. But the other stuff that would be considered heavy duty, then he would go outside and buy it.
By the 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa's partnership with organized crime had grown strong. They had plans of expansion out west, and he had access to millions of dollars. Hoffa didn't create Las Vegas, but he built a good portion of it with money loaned to the mob from the Teamsters pension fund that he established in 1955.
The Teamsters was an offshoot of the Mafia, and in a lot of ways, Hoffa was a mobster that was parading as a labor politician. In another life, Jimmy Hoffa might have been a mob capo.
I present to you our honored guest, Jimmy Hoffa.
April of 1956, a smiling Teamsters president, Dave Beck, honors his popular vice president, Jimmy Hoffa. Within a year, Hoffa would secretly feed the government information about Beck's corrupt dealings that would trigger investigations by the IRS, FBI, and eventually the United States Senate.
Despite charges that he had taken over $300,000 of union funds, Teamster President Dave Beck continued his stubborn silence yesterday as the latest series of hearings on corrupt practices in organized labor came to a clashing halt.
The McClellan Committee was formed to investigate the influence of organized crime in labor. The committee's chief counsel was a young lawyer from Massachusetts named Bobby Kennedy.
Is this the Teamsters again or some other union?
It involves the Teamsters plus 2 or 3 other unions.
Teamster President Dave Beck was among the first called to testify.
Do you honestly believe that if you answered truthfully under oath questions that this committee might ask you regarding your transactions with the union that you represent, that a truthful answer thereto might tend to incriminate you?
The answer is it might.
Beck invoked his Fifth Amendment right to silence 117 times. And though he stymied the Senate, Beck was later convicted on corruption charges and sent to prison, which opened the door for Jimmy Hoffa.
And jubilant Jimmy Hoffa sweeps in as new president of the Teamsters.
Hoffa was a constant target of investigations, but he remained a champion of the rank and file and was elected president of the Teamsters in 1957 by a 3-to-1 margin. His rise to the Marble Palace in Washington was complete. Jimmy Hoffa fought and won many battles in Detroit, but now he was on the radar of the Kennedy brothers, and the fight that took him to Washington stirred genuine hatred on both sides. Hoffa and the Kennedys, a blood feud, when we come back.
He was a great enemy of Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby, it went beyond politics. They hated each other.
I'll break his back.
Who?
You.
Say to who?
to anyone.
Figure of his speech, I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, Mr. Hoffa, all I'm trying to find out, I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I'm trying to find out whose back you were going to break.
Figure of speech.
Bobby Kennedy, to me, is the greatest crime fighter who's ever lived. I mean, he went after, when he was chief counsel of the Senate Rackets Committee, he was eating mafia guys for breakfast.
But initially, Bobby Kennedy was reluctant to take on the labor unions. An investigative reporter named Clark Mollenhoff, who had uncovered links between the unions and the mob, pushed Kennedy, pushed him hard.
He was almost bullying Bobby, saying, well, you'll never go after the unions because your brother might want to run for president someday and you're a Democrat and you need the unions. So you're not tough enough to go after the unions, but you need to have this committee that you're on take a look.
When the McClellan hearings opened, Bobby Kennedy aimed his laser focus on Hoffa.
I don't intend to have the impression left that's been stated publicly that I'm controlled by gangsters. I am not controlled by them.
Mr. Hoffa, that would make a great deal of sense. I'd be very sympathetic if it wasn't for the fact that a majority of these people are in the Central States Conference. You've got people in Detroit, at least 15 who have police records. You've got Joey Glimko in Chicago. I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people then.
Well, I don't propose to...
You haven't moved against any of them.
I don't propose to act tough.
Kennedy challenged Hoffa about alleged kickbacks from the mob. In this exchange, $20,000 in cash with no clear source.
No, sir, I cannot, and I don't care to try and recall back my entire lifetime since I started working at the age 17 as to how I accumulated money or how I spent it, to finally arrive at having $20,000 I could afford to invest, and finally lost.
Could you answer, was it in cash that you put it in?
Yes.
Do you have any record of it?
No.
Would you tell us where you got the cash?
I accumulated it.
It played like a boxing match between two heavyweights, though Hoffa was the savvy veteran. He bobbed and weaved through the hearings, and Kennedy never landed a solid punch.
It amazes me that you have such a poor memory about your relationship with Johnny Deal during these months of 1953.
Well, it may amaze you, but I assure you that my memory, as the best that I could recall at this moment, is such.
The McClellan hearings lasted 270 days, questioned 1,500 witnesses, and convicted 20 individuals. But Jimmy Hoffa walked away clean. But the Kennedy-Hoffa feud was only just beginning. In 1960, John Kennedy was elected president, which forever steamed Hoffa.
I don't believe you publicly endorsed former Vice President Richard Nixon, but would you have been happier to see him move into the White House?
Yes, I would have rather seen Vice President Nixon elect President of the United States.
Kennedy named his brother Bobby Attorney General. He formed a strike force that came to be known as the Get Hoffa Squad. Bobby Kennedy made it his life's mission to put Jimmy Hoffa in prison. While they were often on opposite sides of the law, RFK and Hoffa were actually alike in some ways.
They each used every tactic in the book. They planted moles in each other's camps. They wiretapped each other.
In 1962, Hoffa went on trial for bribery. As far as the law regarding bugs and wiretaps, America was still the Wild West. Bobby Kennedy had the FBI. Hoffa had his adopted son, Chucky O'Brien, and Bernie the Bug Spindell.
I worked with Bernie. We bugged the judge's office, the judge's phone in Chattanooga, and we wired the FBI. I mean, they were doing it to us, so we did the reverse.
Bobby Kennedy believed he had a slam-dunk case against Hoffa. When asked for a prediction of the outcome, he said, "If Hoffa is acquitted, I'll jump off the top of the Capitol Dome." The trial ended with a hung jury, and the judge declared a mistrial.
Hoffa was defended by an up-and-coming lawyer named Edward Bennett Williams. After Hoffa was acquitted, Edward Bennett Williams sent a parachute over to Bobby Kennedy's office to kind of give him a little dig.
I stand here today before you as I stood in front of that court and took an oath that I was not then guilty, nor am I guilty now.
Only Jimmy Hoffa can rejoice at his continued good luck. Honest union members and the general public can only regard it as a tragedy.
I was on Stemmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president.
November 22nd, 1963. The country was shaken by tragedy.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
Every person listening at this moment has flashed back to that day in April 1945 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt...
Excuse me, Chet. Here is a flash from the Associated Press, Dateline Dallas. 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds.
Every American with a recollection of that day remembers where they were when the news broke. Jimmy Hoffa was in Miami.
In the restaurant, when Hoffa learned of that, he got to his feet and cheered and was very happy about that. And then after that, he refused to drop the flag half-mast at Teamster headquarters in D.C.
16 years later, Congress established the House Select Committee on Assassinations, assigned the job of reviewing the conclusions by the Warren Commission that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. Chief legal counsel of that committee was Robert Blakey.
What we concluded, because of time run out, that yes, there was a conspiracy.
The committee discovered that both the FBI and CIA had information about Lee Harvey Oswald that they had withheld from the Warren Commission. That President Lyndon Johnson had pressured the FBI to close the investigation quickly for political reasons. He didn't want talk of a conspiracy hanging over him in the 1964 presidential campaign. Acoustical evidence of a 4th shot had been ignored. And then there were the witnesses.
The witnesses in the plaza who said a shot came from the grassy knoll were passed off by the Warren Commission as not credible.
Among those witnesses, 3 men in the lead car of the motorcade.
Forrest Souls, head of the Secret Service, the chief of police, and the county sheriff. They all said a shot came from the grassy knoll.
In the months that followed the committee's final report, new evidence alleged the conspiracy was not from within the CIA or the Pentagon or Cuban exiles, but from the Mafia, with Jimmy Hoffa possibly at the center.
I believe Hoffa put a contract out on John Kennedy to stop his brother. I think that the contract was picked up by Carlos Marcello, the Mafia boss of New Orleans, Santo Trafficani, the Mafia boss of Tampa, Florida, who then arranged and executed the murder.
No charges were ever brought in the Kennedy assassination. Jimmy Hoffa had also allegedly tried to recruit a corrupt union boss from Louisiana named Ed Parton to bomb Bobby Kennedy's Virginia home. In an interview with investigator Dan Moldea, Ed Parton shared details of a conversation he said he had once had with Jimmy Hoffa.
I want the plastic explosives. I want, when they go off, they'll burn it, burn all them up. And I said, you mean the kids too? He said, that's right. So they belong to that, don't they? I said, now wait just a minute. I said, I ain't gonna be no part of listening to nothing about kids being killed.
In March of 1964, prosecutors brought new charges of jury tampering against Hoffa. The key government witness was Ed Parton, who said he turned on Hoffa because Parton had 5 children of his own, and Hoffa had violated a code of honor, going after an enemy's family. To the end, Hoffa denied it all.
Even by manufacturing, as he did, deliberate lies, distortions, creating a belief that I had something to do with the jury tampering, if there was such.
Jimmy Hoffa was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years. Later that same year, he was convicted of fraud for improper use of the Union Pension Fund and received an additional 5 years. Jimmy Hoffa's reign over the Teamsters Union was over. In March of 1967, Hoffa went to prison to begin serving his 13-year sentence. He named his longtime friend Frank Fitzsimmons to lead the union while he was gone. And this brings a new player into the story, President Richard Nixon. The backroom deals between Frank Fitzsimmons and Nixon would trigger a violent split in the Teamsters Union and launch Jimmy Hoffa's ill-fated comeback.
They took Fitzsimmons up to the mountain and showed him the valley, and he bought the valley, and he forgot his friends. And then he double-crossed me. It's very simple.
Shut down the entire the entire country with a phone call, snap of a finger. You know, no trucks are moving, nothing's getting shipped cross country. Cartage is shut down because Jimmy Hoffa wants it, and that's a lot of power to wield, and he wielded that power like a blunt instrument.
One of the people who saw that power up close is this man, Marvin the Weasel Elkind. In the late 50s, he was a busboy at the Copacabana in New York. One day, Mob Lieutenant Tony Salerno told Marvin he was getting a new job.
Friday's your last day here. I said, why? I'm trying too hard to do a good job. He says, as of Monday, you're going to be Jimmy Hoffa's driver. I didn't know Jimmy Hoffa, but I heard a lot of stories. I was 18, scared the crap out of me.
3 days later, Marvin met Mr. Jimmy Hoffa.
I says, good morning, Mr. Hoffa. He says, are you Marvin? I goes, yes, sir. He says, good start. Mr. Hoffa or sir, remember that.
Marvin quickly learned there were two ways to perform any assignment, the Hoffa way and the wrong way. Rule number 1.
You must never be late picking me up.
Rule number 2 came with an explanation.
What you hear in this car stays in this car. If I hear you talking to anybody about what you hear in this car, it won't be around the next morning.
For the next 5 years, Marvin drove Mr. Hoffa wherever he wanted to go, often with a distinguished cast of mafia chiefs in the back seat. Marvin says he kept his eyes on the road and wished many times there had been a glass partition between him and the conversations in back.
I was fearful 100% of the time.
Years after he finished that job as a driver, the mob still had their hooks in Marvin, and he got himself in some big-time legal trouble. He was forced to become an informant for the FBI, and they gave him that unflattering nickname, the Weasel. The experience gave Marvin an interesting perspective on working with the feds.
The authorities are no different than the mob. They got you by the throat, they got you by the throat. With the mob, they threatened you openly. The feds did it diplomatically.
In March of 1967, Jimmy Hoffa experienced some of that diplomacy. The most powerful man in America checked into federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He had installed Frank Fitzsimmons as a placeholder of the Teamster presidency until Hoffa would return. But Fitzsimmons had a different plan. He had a comfortable hands-off relationship with organized crime, and he cultivated a cozy relationship with then-President Richard Nixon. In early 1970, Fitzsimmons first broached the subject of a pardon for Jimmy Hoffa.
On 2 or 3 occasions, Fitzsimmons mentioned to me, he said, you know, there's a lot of anxiety in the union about Jimmy Hoffa. I said, Frank, I can't even discuss that with you.
Charles Colson, special counsel to then-President Richard Nixon, was part of many conversations in the White House about Jimmy Hoffa. Nixon wanted Teamster support, and he liked Frank Fitzsimmons, who he viewed as easy to work with and loyal, which Nixon valued above all else. A sentiment he made clear in an Oval Office conversation with Colson.
You remember what I told you when we talked about labor, that somebody has to go in there and clean them out, and he's got 100 people that he's targeted to remove.
Nixon was confident that his dealings with Fitzsimmons were earning him popularity with the Teamsters, which he desperately wanted for his re-election campaign in 1972.
It's a great thing. We're never win the press, but we're going to win these people. Oh, you've got these people. Well, they are ours, and then we're going to work on all of them. Well, with no Fitz, we got him, haven't we? No, solidly. He said he wants to clean them all out. He said he wants nothing but Fitzsimmons, Nixon, loyalists, and Fitz just says to me, we're going to clean them up and get rid of all the people that we can't trust.
Nixon's advisors counseled that releasing Hoffa was politically a good idea. The rank and file still loved him. But Nixon believed Hoffa's release should wait until after Fitzsimmons was elected Teamsters president for another term in the summer of 1971. And Hoffa had to be kept away from the union or he would be trouble, a topic Nixon discussed with Labor Secretary George Shultz.
It might be that we have to try to isolate him to an extent to make him look bad.
I think so.
Because if you don't do that, George, I'm afraid that you're going to have the worst of both worlds. You get out and take the others with him. But if others feel he's a little unpopular, they may not. But I don't know. What do you think?
That's the way I read it. I think we need to isolate him. I have a golfing date today with Frank Fitzsimmons.
Good.
And I'll see what he has to say.
The decision was made. Hoffa would get his release from prison.
He said that we're going to give Hoffa a parole, but on the condition that he never come back into the labor movement again. You can contact Fitzsimmons and tell him what we're doing.
On December 23rd, 1971, Jimmy Hoffa walked free from federal prison after serving 4 years, 9 months, and 16 days.
This morning, Hoffa and his family gathered around the Christmas tree and posed for pictures. Mrs. Hoffa, who is still recovering from a serious heart ailment, was overjoyed by her husband's homecoming.
I didn't think it was possible, though I never gave up hope. And my grateful thanks to President Nixon for making this possible.
Jimmy Hoffa was home, but not happy. He vowed to fight the restriction in court. He blamed his former friend, Frank Fitzsimmons.
They took Fitzsimmons up to the mountain and showed him the valley, and he bought the valley, and he forgot his friends. And then he double-crossed me. It's very simple.
Hoffa sued to have the restriction nullified, but court rulings held it in place. Still, he was determined to regain control of the Teamsters Union because he believed its 3 million members wanted him.
There's kind of a general impression around that although your strength lies with the Teamster membership, Fitzsimmons has tried to build up strength through his close associations with the Nixon administration.
There's no votes in the convention for the Nixon administration. Not a single vote. They can't get them.
And you think that amongst the rank and file, you're still number one?
I would say there's no problem.
But there were serious problems brewing within Local 299 over split loyalty between Hoffa and Fitzsimmons.
There were a series of acts of violence. We're talking about the bombing of Tom Gwilt's home, the bombing of Jim Levitt's home, Gene Page's barn, Dave Johnson's cabin cruiser, the shooting of George Roxborough. He got hit. They shot him in the face with a shotgun.
The boiling point was one more high-profile bombing.
Frank Fitzsimmons' son, Richard Fitzsimmons, is at Nemo's Bar over by Tiger Stadium. His car's parked there, and his union car, it's not his own personal car, it's his union car, is bombed.
Are you absolutely certain that no one within 299 had anything to do with that car bombing?
I would bet my life on it.
From the outside, it looked like a mutual struggle for power. On one side, Frank Fitzsimmons and his designated muscle in Local 299, Roland McMaster. On the other side, Jimmy Hoffa. The war appeared to be each side with thugs committing acts of violence against the other. But investigator Dan Moldea says that wasn't the case at all.
Now, all the violence was one way. It was all going one way. It was all going against Hoffa's people.
Moldea says Frank Fitzsimmons was behind the bombing of his own son's car.
To show that there's real violence going on both sides, they decided to bomb Dick Fitzsimmons' car.
Oh, so that was strictly for show?
It was purely for show.
It was a message for Jimmy Hoffa. One final warning to back off, but he wouldn't do it. Hoffa wanted the power back in his hands, and his obsession with that proved fatal. Who killed Jimmy Hoffa? When we come back, Hollywood's latest take on that question.
Hiya, Frank. This is Jimmy Hoffa. Hiya, Frank. This is Jimmy Hoffa.
A blockbuster film just released, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Al Pacino as Jimmy Hoffa, Robert De Niro as Frank Sheeran, who's the title character, the Irishman. The film is billed as the real story of what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. But many of the experts we talked to are not convinced.
Scorsese's movie on Frank Sheeran is his homage to Oliver Stone's JFK. Great cinema, horrible history.
Jimmy, I'm trying to tell you something. I know you are. You're telling me to threatening me, and I got to do what they say, which is absolutely. It's the bottom line.
Dan Moldea says Jimmy Hoffa always downplayed his associations with organized crime, and that tells an incomplete story.
I'm sure this film is going to portray him as he tried to portray himself during those early days as a hero of the rank and file, as a working class hero.
The title character of the movie, The Irishman, is Frank Sheeran. He was a high-ranking officer in the Teamsters Union and a longtime friend of Jimmy Hoffa. Several years before Frank Sheeran died, he wrote a book detailing his relationship with organized crime, although actually he wrote 2 books about his life in the mob. The first one generated very little interest.
And his book couldn't sell. And then when they put it back on the market with him telling everyone that he was the one that killed Jimmy Hoffa, it sold, became a New York Times bestseller, and now Marty Scorsese, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci are making a movie out of it.
This is not to say that Frank Sheeran wasn't a very bad guy. He had a close relationship with Pennsylvania mob boss Russell Bufalino and took on the role of hired muscle. But Sheeran spoke with apparent pride at being a mob hitman responsible for several highly publicized assassinations.
I'm sure Frank Sheeran did some pretty nasty work. I just don't think he's committed the murders, these big murders he's confessed to.
I don't believe one word out of Frank Sheeran's mouth.
You gotta sit down, everybody says so.
Dan Moldea says a couple of years ago he crossed paths with Robert De Niro and couldn't resist sharing his critique of the project.
I wasn't even there to be diplomatic. I was there to get in his face. And I talked to him that day, that night, the way he talked to people at the movies, because he was giving me this nonsense that this is the story about Jimmy Hoffa's death. This is the true story. And I said, Bob, you're being conned.
And it went downhill from there. So if not Frank Sheeran, then who did kill Jimmy Hoffa and why? We'll get some answers when we come back.
When I had coffee with him the day before, I warned him. I said, Mr. Hoffa, there's a lot of people very upset. And his words to me were, my people will never harm me.
In the spring of 1975, Jimmy Hoffa was restless and angry. He wanted the Teamsters presidency back that he felt had been stolen from him.
You know, after Nixon pardoned him and he found out he couldn't get back into the Union, he was going to take every effort he could to do that. And in order to do that, he had threatened to reveal the mob's involvement with the Teamsters.
Hoffa began his campaign by meeting with crime bosses around the country.
And he holds these meetings. He kind of takes the temperature. And he realizes that the mob doesn't want him back, that they don't want him as the president again. They're going to do everything in their effort to prevent him from taking the presidency back.
The union gave Hoffa a $1.7 million lump sum pension payout. The message was clear.
Hey, thanks, Jimmy. Here's a whole bunch of money. Now go away and enjoy your retirement.
But Hoffa wouldn't let go. He decided he needed to make peace with an old friend, Tony Provenzano, a Teamster official and a captain in the Genovese crime family in New York. At one time, they had been good friends, but Hoffa and Tony Pro had become bitter enemies over power and money.
Threats being thrown back and forth, not just threats to murder each other, but threats to murder each other's families. It got incredibly bitter, incredibly intense, very fast.
But now Hoffa needed Provenzano back on his side.
If Hoffa wants to win back the Teamsters presidency, it's necessary that he makes peace with Provenzano, because Provenzano controls the entire delegation on the East Coast. He controls the voting bloc that Hoffa needs to win back the presidency.
Hoffa and Provenzano met on neutral ground to talk out their differences. It didn't go well.
And it was a bit of a disaster, where you had both men meeting in a hotel suite in Miami and supposedly grabbing a hold of each other and trying to choke the life out of each other before they were separated.
Getting no help from mob bosses and no help from Tony Provenzano, Jimmy Hoffa went to option number 3, a media tour to sell his comeback to the American public.
He was playing a card and speaking to the mob through the media. And this didn't sit very well with them. They don't like being threatened.
Hoffa was running out of options. The word on the street was that he had cut a deal.
At this point, I believe Hoffa went to the FBI, went to the U.S. Attorney's Office. You help get the restriction from my commutation lifted so I can run in 1976. and I will give you information on organized crime, and when I get into office, I will purge the organized crime influence from the Teamsters.
Rumors of that arrangement may have sealed Jimmy Hoffa's fate.
Some members of Hoffa's own former inner circle, one person being Chucky O'Brien, was going around telling people in Detroit that Jimmy Hoffa was a snitch, that Jimmy Hoffa was an FBI informant.
The decision was made at the highest levels of organized crime in Detroit, Chicago, New York. Hoffa had to go.
The best way to get Hoffa out in the open was to tell him that Tony Provenzano was open to making a peace agreement.
The meeting was set. Detroit crime boss Tony Giacalone would broker a truce between Hoffa and Provenzano. Hoffa's former driver, Marvin Elkin, says he had a bad feeling.
When I had coffee with him the day before, I warned him. I said, Mr. Hoffa, there's a lot of people very upset. And his words to me were, my people will never harm me.
On the afternoon of July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa drove to the parking lot of the Marcus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township and waited. 90 minutes after the scheduled 2 p.m. meet, a car with several men inside picked up Jimmy Hoffa, and he was never seen again.
We would also like to make a special appeal to the some 2 million brother and sister Teamster members for them to aid us in solving this heartbreaking mystery.
Tony Giacalone told the FBI there never was a planned meeting, and he made sure he had a solid alibi with witnesses for the day Hoffa disappeared.
He spent the entire day in the Southfield Athletic Club, and he was not a particularly approachable person in normal events, but it seems like every 15 minutes he was asking somebody in the Southfield Athletic Club, what time is it now?
Tony Provenzano had people in New Jersey who swore he was there in meetings all day with them. The FBI suspected Jimmy Hoffa's estranged adopted son, Chucky O'Brien, as one of the men in the car that carried Hoffa to his execution. But Chucky had a fish story of an alibi.
I'm carrying it in the house, and she's a particular housekeeper, and she's yelling at me, "You're ruining my floor, you're getting that water and blood all over."
O'Brien said he had borrowed a car from Joey Giacalone, son of Tony, to deliver a large frozen salmon to Teamster executive Bobby Holmes and his wife. Holmes stood by that alibi.
She told me that she had to wash the kitchen floor and mop up the blood that was in the, or the water, the blood, wherever it was that was in the garage.
What did he do with the salmon when he brought it in?
Brought it in here, my wife butchered it up, staked it, and put it in the deep freeze.
So you've got it in the freezer now?
Some of it, we've eaten some.
Would we be able to see it?
No, what the hell you think I am?
The FBI focused on 2 men as Hoffa's suspected assassins, Thomas Andretta and Salvatore Briguglio, both soldiers in the Genovese crime family who worked for Tony Provenzano. Briguglio was brought twice before a federal grand jury in Detroit investigating Hoffa's disappearance. He refused to testify, and the FBI never had enough evidence to charge him. A guy named Phil Moscato, who owned a notorious landfill in New Jersey, shared his ideas with investigator Dan Modea.
He would not say right out, Sal Briguglio is the guy who killed Hoff. He said Frank Sheeran did not kill him. It's bull. He did not kill him. Frank Sheeran had nothing to do with the actual murder of Hoff, but he would not say Sal, his best friend, was.
But you believe he was?
Oh, no doubt about it.
All signs pointed toward a cooperative effort.
I do believe personally that the Provenzanos and Andretta and the people from Jersey were the principal moving figures, although I do believe people in the Detroit organized crime family were involved as well.
No charges were ever brought against anyone in Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. Which brings us to the question that has kept the mystery alive for more than 40 years. Where is Jimmy Hoffa?
We're riding down the elevator, and I said, you know, Mr. Vitale, I can keep you out of jail. All you got to do is tell me where Jimmy Hoffa is.
For 40 years. Where is Jimmy Hoffa's body? In May of 2004, police pulled up floorboards in a northwest Detroit home, but found nothing. 2012, police dug up a backyard in Roseville. Nothing. 2013, acting on a tip from mobster Tony Zarelli, who died 2 years later, the FBI dug on a farm on Buell Road in Oakland Township.
All the speculation of where he is and where he is not.
They say he was in a meat grinder, and it's all baloney. What happened to Hoffa was very simple. He got picked up over there. He was buried where I said he's buried.
But Hoffa was not buried there. Why have there been so many seemingly credible tips? Detroit crime historian Scott Bernstein says it's because the Giacalone brothers launched a campaign of misinformation to cover up the perfect crime.
They would, intentionally tell 30 people 30 different things. And those 30 people that they were telling this knew that the person that were telling them would be in the know. So it would then kind of filter out towards people that they then told.
There is no shortage of theories on what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Number one, Keith Corbett, former assistant U.S. attorney, and Scott Bernstein have come to the same conclusion, that there is no body to be found.
I believe then the body was disposed of at a place called Central Sanitation in Hamtramck.
It was owned by Pete Vitale and Jimmy Quasarano.
And they had these gigantic compressors for cardboard where they compressed 3, 4, 5 tons of cardboard at one time and shred it down to little pieces of paper.
I believe that Jimmy Hoffa was incinerated.
And then, surprisingly, a couple of months after Hoffa disappeared, the place burned down.
What a coincidence.
What a coincidence.
And it was before the FBI could ever get a search warrant to get in there.
A logical and credible theory, but it's only one of many. Possibility number two, a new character enters the story. A small-time criminal named Donovan Wells, who died this past year. Wells was represented at one time by a Birmingham lawyer, now retired, named Jim Ellsman.
Yeah, I got him off through talking to the FBI to cut a deal, and they did cut him a reduced deal. But that FBI was so screwed up.
In 2006, an FBI search focused on a farm in Milford, once owned by Union leader and Hoffa enemy Roland McMaster. Donovan Wells and his wife lived on that farm back in 1975. At that time, neither of them shared with the FBI what they claimed to have seen on that day that Hoffa disappeared.
She's in the kitchen and she's washing dishes, looking out towards Pontiac Trail. And she sees 2 cars come screaming down Pontiac Trail, make a hard right into this dirt road, which goes all the way into the back.
He observes out the kitchen window of McMaster's farmhouse, close by, a backhoe digging, and then a white sheet and a body dropped into the hole. That's all I can remember.
He saw this? He said he saw this?
He saw it with his eyeballs. That's right.
I believe that Hoffa was murdered on that farm. I think the cars roaring up, I think that's where the death was. I think those were the death. Hoffa was in one of those cars and he was murdered.
The FBI dug up that farm, but found nothing. But Dan Moldea throws an interesting wrinkle into that episode. He says Donovan Wells showed him a diagram of the farm with the exact location of the hole where he claimed to have seen someone dump a body. A diagram the FBI used to pick their spot for the 2006 excavation.
They got south and north mixed up. They were supposed to be digging over here.
So the FBI dug in the wrong place?
They dug in the wrong place. They inverted the map, the diagram that Don had drawn for them, didn't bring him up from Lexington, and they dug in the wrong place.
Does that mean Hoffa's body might be buried on that farm in Milford? Dan Moldea says he now believes the body was there originally, but moved.
Murdered, 55-gallon drum, Gateway Transportation, New Jersey.
New Jersey landfill operator Phil Moscato told Dan Moldea about a day in 1975 when hitman Sam Brugulio pulled up in a truck.
He tells me on tape that the Gateway truck pulls up at his dump and he and Sal unload the 55-gallon drum and bury it at his dump.
Now keep in mind, that's a theory. There are more. Hoffa's former driver, Marvin Elkind, believes Jimmy Hoffa is buried under the Renaissance Center. He remembers a Teamsters convention in Detroit back in the 70s.
I was there at the convention, doing my job, bringing the executives drinks, getting them what they needed, lighting their cigars, stuff like that.
Marvin says his source is Detroit mob boss Tony Giacalone. Marvin was part of Mr. Giacalone's entourage. As they walked past the Renaissance Center, the man known as Tony Jack turned to the group.
And he goes, "Boys, say good morning to Mr. Hoffa." So there's no question in my mind, never has been, that's exactly where he is.
Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Keith Corbett says one day about 30 years ago, he took his own swing at solving the Jimmy Hoffa mystery. He found himself in an elevator at the federal courthouse with Peter Vitale, a Detroit capo convicted of extortion. Corbett thought, might as well ask.
I said, you know, Mr. Vitale, I can keep you out of jail. All you got to do is tell me where Jimmy Hoffa is. And he looked at me, and, you know, I was probably in my early 30s at the time, and he was probably 70. He looked at me, he said, I don't rat out my friend. Not, I don't know who did it, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't rat out my friends. And that was the code that many of those people live by.
Maybe Peter Vitale did know the answer. And there are those who believe the FBI knows the answers, but is keeping many of the Hoffa files a secret. Why? 25 years ago, the late Ken Walton, at one time special agent in charge of the Detroit FBI office, made a surprising statement.
I know who killed Jimmy Hoffa, and I know why they killed Jimmy Hoffa.
Walton said the FBI had insufficient evidence for prosecutors to move forward with charges, so none were ever filed, and many files locked away. We reached out to the current FBI, but we're told the Bureau doesn't comment on open cases.
Well, both the Giacalones are gone, Toco's gone, there can't be, the people in New Jersey are gone now. There may be some peripheral figures, but all the main players have passed on.
The Detroit Free Press fought a 10-year legal battle over FBI files sought through the Freedom of Information Act. The Free Press sued the government twice, and finally the FBI was forced to release thousands of pages of Hoffa documents. Here's a sample of some of those documents, so heavily redacted as to render them useless. Should the FBI release the remaining Hoffa files? The answer is yes, or no, depending upon who you talk to.
If you can't indict somebody and convict them, you really shouldn't throw names out in the press. And despite what we may see in politics today.
When you start getting into this, and Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy, who Hoffa hated, are involved, there could be lots of motivation for the FBI to say, we want this to go cold.
So if the sealed files protect some group or individuals, who is it?
And the answer is, I don't know.
Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Will we ever get all of the answers? Probably not. But in reporting or investigating crime and corruption, just as important as the answers is that ethical and persistent people keep asking questions.